At 60, her in-laws mocked the house she inherited until they discovered what was on those lands. At 60, Eleanor Vance had reached a point in her life where she no longer expected surprises. She had spent so long enduring disappointments that she learned to live without expecting too much from anyone. For 40 years, she was married to James Vance, a man she loved deeply and with whom she shared joys, difficulties, and dreams. However, from the day she became part of the Sterling family, she understood that for some, she would never be enough. It didn't matter how much she strived, how much she helped, or how much time she spent with them. They always saw her as the humble girl who had come from a small Midwestern town to marry the son of an affluent East Coast family. While James lived, things were difficult, but bearable. He tried to protect her when he could. Sometimes he argued with his parents over comments they made about her. Other times he simply tried to change the subject to avoid conflicts. But after James's death, everything changed. Eleanor ceased to be the eldest son's wife and became an uncomfortable presence for the family. Every visit, every meal, and every gathering ended with some insinuation designed to remind her that she no longer had an important place among them. That morning began like any other. Eleanor was sitting in the kitchen of the old family estate where she had lived for decades. The house was large, but it felt empty since James was gone. As she brewed coffee, she heard voices coming from the main living room. She immediately recognized Richard, her late husband's younger brother. Richard had always been ambitious. From a young age, he seemed to measure people's worth by their money. Eleanor had never had a good relationship with him, but in recent years the situation had worsened. Without making a sound, she stayed in the kitchen as the voices became clear. Richard was talking to Edward, his father. Both seemed focused on an important matter. Eleanor had no intention of eavesdropping, but one phrase caught her attention. Richard said the development firm was still interested in buying the land. Edward replied that it was an opportunity they couldn't let pass. Eleanor froze. She knew exactly what land they were referring to. It was the land surrounding the house where she lived. Richard commented that the only problem was still Eleanor. He spoke those words with a coldness that chilled her blood. Edward replied that sooner or later she would have to leave. According to him, it no longer made sense for her to occupy such a large property. Eleanor felt a knot in her stomach. That was the house where she had raised her children. There she had celebrated birthdays, Christmases, and family gatherings. Every corner held memories of her life with James. To hear them talk about her as an obstacle was painful. She remained silent until the voices disappeared. Then she sat at the table and stared at her coffee cup without tasting it. For several minutes, she tried to convince herself not to attach importance to it, but it was impossible. Deep down, she knew it wasn't a simple conversation. It was proof that they had been planning to get her out of there for some time. The following days were uncomfortable. Richard constantly appeared with new excuses to visit the property. Sometimes he brought architects. Other times he appeared accompanied by people who claimed to be evaluating future projects. They all walked the grounds as if it were already theirs. Eleanor tried to remain calm, but each visit increased her feeling of slowly being pushed out of her own home. One afternoon, she received an unexpected call. The number was unknown. When she answered, a formal voice introduced itself as a representative of a legal firm. The man asked if he was speaking with Eleanor Vance. She replied yes. Then she received news that left her confused. A woman named Evelyn Beaumont had recently passed away and had included her in her will. Eleanor took a few seconds to react. She vaguely remembered a distant aunt from her mother's side of the family. She had only seen her a couple of times as a child. She didn't understand why that woman would leave her anything. The lawyer asked her to come to the office the next day to review the documents. Eleanor accepted more out of curiosity than anything else. The next morning, she presented herself at the firm. The lawyer showed her several papers. Among them were deeds to an old property located in a town called Harmony Creek. There were also documents related to a large tract of land surrounding the house. Eleanor looked at the papers without understanding. She asked several times if it wasn't a mistake. The lawyer confirmed that everything was correct. Evelyn had left very clear instructions. The heir was Eleanor. When she left the office, she carried a folder full of documents and an enormous number of questions in her head. On her way home, she couldn't stop thinking about that unexpected inheritance. What she didn't imagine was that the news had already reached the Sterling family. That same afternoon, she received a call from Patricia, her mother-in-law. With unusual cordiality, she invited her to dinner that night at the family estate. Eleanor immediately suspected something was up. For years, she had learned to recognize when that family acted out of self-interest. Still, she agreed to attend. Upon arriving at Edward and Patricia's enormous estate, She felt the same discomfort as always. The house looked impeccable. Everything seemed designed to impress anyone who crossed the threshold. Richard was the first to approach and greet her. He smiled too much. That made her nervous. Shortly after, everyone sat at the table. For the first few minutes, they talked about unimportant topics. They commented on some local news and discussed family business. Eleanor remained silent most of the time. She knew that sooner or later someone would mention the inheritance. Finally, it was Richard who did. He asked what the property she had received was like. Eleanor explained that she had barely seen a few photographs. Then, Richard pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. He said he had obtained more images of the place. He distributed them among those present. As soon as they looked at them, the laughter began. The photographs showed an old farmhouse with peeling paint, dusty windows, and fields choked with weeds and dry, brittle brush. Edward let out a loud laugh. Patricia said it looked like a structure abandoned for 100 years. Other relatives began to make mocking comments. One said that the car parked outside was probably worth more than the entire property. Another commented that the house seemed to perfectly reflect Eleanor's aspirations. The laughter intensified. Eleanor remained still. She felt their eyes on her. Richard looked at a photograph and pretended to analyze it seriously before saying that the inheritance was a real tragedy. Patricia added that at least now Eleanor had a suitable place to retire. The table once again filled with laughter. Eleanor felt a mix of sadness and anger. For years she had endured similar humiliations. But that night something was different. Perhaps because she was tired. Perhaps because James was no longer there to soften those situations. Or perhaps because she realized that she would never gain the respect of those people. As they continued to mock the house, Eleanor looked again at one of the photographs. Despite the neglect, there was something about that property that caught her attention. She didn't know exactly what it was. Perhaps the feeling that it represented an opportunity to start over. Perhaps the simple fact that it didn't belong to the Sterlings. When dinner ended, she quietly stood up. She said goodbye without arguing with anyone. The laughter continued as she walked towards the exit. However, as she closed the door behind her, she made a decision that would change the rest of her life. For the first time in many years, she didn't think about what the Sterling family wanted. She thought only about what she wanted. And as she drove home under the city lights, she realized that she was ready to go to Harmony Creek and discover why a woman she barely remembered had decided to leave her that strange inheritance. The decision was made. 2 weeks after that humiliating dinner, Eleanor Vance finished packing her last belongings into several cardboard boxes. It wasn't an emotional farewell. No one from the Sterling family appeared to help her. No one asked if she needed anything. In fact, it seemed everyone was pleased to see her leave. Richard even stopped by the property the morning of her departure. He arrived, smiling, looked at the boxes loaded into the truck, and wished her good luck with a kindness that sounded completely false. Eleanor responded politely, but inwardly she felt relief knowing that she would soon stop seeing him every day. When she finally started the vehicle and drove away from the city, she felt something strange. It wasn't exactly happiness, nor sadness. It was a feeling of uncertainty mixed with freedom. For years she had lived dependent on what others thought. Now, for the first time in a long time, she had no idea what awaited her. The journey to Harmony Creek was long. As she drove along the rural American highways, the landscapes began to change. The large avenues gradually disappeared. Buildings were replaced by open fields, rolling hills, and increasingly quiet roads. Eleanor watched everything from the window as she recalled the photographs of the property. She tried to imagine what it would be like to live there. At times she thought she was doing something crazy. After all, she was 60 years old. Many people at that age sought comfort and tranquility. She, however, was moving alone to a town she barely knew. However, every time she remembered the Sterling family's taunts, she regained her determination. Hours later, the sign announcing the entrance to Harmony Creek appeared. Eleanor slowed down and observed the place carefully. It was a small town. The main streets preserved old buildings. Some facades showed signs of the years passing. There was a simple town square, a stone church, and several family businesses. It didn't seem like a rich or modern place. Rather, it gave the impression of being stuck in another era. Still, there was something pleasant about the atmosphere. People walked unhurriedly. Some neighbors chatted sitting in front of their houses. Others greeted passers-by. Eleanor followed the directions in the inheritance documents until she reached a dirt road leading out of town. After several minutes, she finally saw the property. As she stopped the truck, she remained still, observing the scene. The photographs had not exaggerated anything. The house was visibly deteriorated. The paint had almost disappeared. Several windows were covered in dust. Vegetation grew wildly around some areas. An old wooden gate leaned to one side. The land was enormous, much larger than she had imagined. In the distance, a structure that appeared to have been a barn decades ago could be seen. There were also ancient fences and dry, gnarled trees scattered across different areas. Eleanor slowly got out of the vehicle. For a few seconds, she contemplated everything in silence. This was hers. It was hard to believe. She took out the keys the lawyer had given her and walked to the front door. The lock resisted before opening. When she pushed the door, a cloud of dust floated in the air. The interior was dark. The smell of confinement was evident. Eleanor advanced cautiously. The furniture remained covered by old sheets. Some rooms seemed untouched, as if someone had suddenly abandoned the house many years ago. As she walked through the place, she tried to imagine who Evelyn had really been. She barely retained vague memories of her. However, that woman had lived there for part of her life. Every object seemed to hold a story. She found old photographs on a shelf. Some showed family gatherings, others portrayed people Eleanor didn't recognize. After several hours of exploration and basic cleaning, she decided to rest. She was exhausted. That night she settled into a room she had managed to partially clean. The silence was profound, very different from the constant noise of the city. As she looked at the ceiling before falling asleep, she began to wonder if she would truly be able to start a new life there. The next morning she was awakened by the sound of several knocks on the front door. She quickly got up and went to open it. On the other side, she found a woman of about 50 who smiled kindly. She introduced herself as Rosie Jenkins. She lived on a nearby property and had seen movement in the house after many years. Rosie welcomed her to the town and brought her a basket of homemade food. Eleanor was surprised by the gesture. It had been a long time since anyone had shown her such kindness. They chatted for several minutes. Rosie told her a few things about Harmony Creek. She explained that many young people had left the area in search of work. She also mentioned that Evelyn's house had always aroused curiosity among the locals. When Eleanor asked why, Rosie simply replied that Evelyn was a reserved woman who rarely spoke of her past. That answer sparked her curiosity even more. Over the next few days, Eleanor dedicated herself to cleaning the house. The work was enormous. There were rooms that had been closed for years. She found boxes full of old documents, antique utensils, and forgotten furniture. While tidying one of the second-floor rooms, she discovered a small door hidden behind a wardrobe. She would never have seen it if she hadn't moved the furniture to clean. Upon opening it, she found a kind of storage room. There were several dusty boxes. Eleanor began to examine them one by one. Most contained common objects, photographs, old clothes, and some books. But at the bottom, she found a wooden chest much better preserved than the rest. It was locked. For several minutes, she tried to open it without success. Finally, she decided to look for tools and managed to force the lock. When she lifted the lid, she discovered dozens of perfectly organized envelopes. They were letters, many letters. Some were more than 50 years old. Eleanor picked one at random and began to read. She soon realized that most were addressed to Evelyn. Several mentioned family matters. Others spoke of land, documents, and agreements that she didn't fully understand. However, one sentence immediately caught her attention. In one of the letters, someone warned that certain secrets should remain hidden until the right person arrived. Eleanor frowned, continuing to review the contents of the chest. Beneath the letters, she found several notebooks and some hand-drawn maps. None seemed recent. Everything was decades old. The more she looked at those documents, the more evident it became that Evelyn had been investigating something for many years. That night, Eleanor took several of the papers to the dining table to analyze them calmly. She didn't understand much of what she read, but she sensed that these documents were connected. Some names appeared repeatedly. There were also constant references to land, properties, and events that had occurred a long time ago. While reviewing one of the maps, she found a mark made with red ink in a specific area of the property. She didn't know what it meant, but she decided to memorize it. Something told her it wasn't a mere coincidence. Outside, the sun began to set behind the hills surrounding Harmony Creek. Eleanor looked out the window. The landscape was tinged with orange as the town prepared for night. For the first time since James's death, she felt an emotion different from pain or resignation. She felt curiosity. The old house was not just a forgotten inheritance. Slowly, it began to resemble a puzzle full of hidden pieces. And somewhere among those letters, those maps, and those secrets kept for decades, Eleanor had a feeling that the true story was just beginning. The next morning, Eleanor woke before sunrise. She had slept little. The letters found inside the old chest kept swirling in her head. For much of the night, she had been reviewing the phrases she had read. There was something strange about those documents. They didn't seem like simple family memories kept by an elderly woman. They gave the impression of being part of an investigation that had lasted for years. As she brewed coffee in the old kitchen, she looked again at the envelopes arranged on the table. Some were yellowed with age, others retained a surprisingly good appearance. What struck her most was that many letters spoke of properties, records, and events that had occurred decades ago. After breakfast, she decided to review the material more calmly. She began by organizing the letters by date. The task took her several hours. As she progressed, she began to note patterns. Some names appeared again and again. There were frequent references to a family named Caldwell, another named Morgan, and several mentions of people who had lived in the region during the turn of the 20th century, a time of significant land shifts. Eleanor didn't recognize any of those names but understood they were important to understanding what Evelyn had been investigating. While reading one of the oldest envelopes, she found a sheet folded several times. Upon opening it, she discovered a handwritten list. At the top appeared a simple but unsettling phrase: "Do not forget who the true owners were." Eleanor stared at those words for several seconds. She didn't understand exactly what they referred to, but something about them piqued her curiosity. She continued reviewing documents until noon. In one of the notebooks, she found notes made by Evelyn over different years. Some pages contained dates, others had names accompanied by addresses or references to historical archives. There were also simple drawings of areas of the property. The strangest thing was that many notes seemed incomplete, as if Evelyn had assumed that someday someone else would continue her work. Eleanor closed the notebook and sighed. She needed help, no matter how interested she was. She didn't know how to interpret historical documents or investigate facts that had occurred so long ago. That afternoon, she decided to go to town. She needed to clear her mind. As she walked through the town square, she observed the quiet routine of Harmony Creek. Some merchants arranged goods in front of their shops. Several people chatted on benches. The atmosphere was very different from the accelerated pace of the city. She entered a small cafe for a cold drink. While waiting for her drink, she overheard a conversation at a nearby table. Two men were talking about a historical conference to be held in a neighboring county. One of them mentioned a young researcher named Dr. Alex Thorne. He commented that he was one of the people who knew the most about the history of the region. The name stuck in Eleanor's mind. Minutes later, she decided to ask about him. The cafe owner smiled. "Of course, we know him. Alex comes here often. He's a historian." "Yes, he's always researching old things. Archives, documents, town histories. He loves all that." Eleanor felt that she might have just found the help she needed. The woman told her where she could find him. The next day, Eleanor drove to the neighboring town. After several inquiries, she found a small office where Alex was conducting some research. When she arrived, she saw a man in his early 30s reviewing several documents on a table. He looked like someone used to spending hours among archives. Eleanor introduced herself and briefly explained the situation. Alex listened attentively. When she mentioned Evelyn's letters, his interest was immediate. "You still have those documents?" "Yes, all of them. As far as I know." Alex became thoughtful. "There are many stories about Evelyn Beaumont. Stories, nothing very clear, just rumors. Some people said she had been investigating something related to old land for years." Eleanor felt a shiver that perfectly matched what she was finding. Alex agreed to visit the property the next day. When he arrived at the old house, he spent several minutes looking at the documents before saying a single word. He reviewed letters, notebooks, and maps. His expression slowly changed. He seemed increasingly intrigued. Finally, he looked up. "This is much more important than it seems." "What does it mean?" "I don't know yet." But Evelyn was following a lead for decades. For hours they analyzed the papers together. Alex identified references to historical archives in different cities. He also found names linked to old families in the region. On several occasions, he stopped to take notes. He seemed fascinated. As evening fell, they discovered something particularly interesting. Between 2 pages of a notebook, a letter appeared that Eleanor had not seen before. It was hidden inside an inner cover. The paper was much older than the others. The signature was difficult to read, but one phrase immediately caught both their attention. "What was buried must never fall into the wrong hands." Eleanor exchanged a look with Alex. "Buried, that's what it says here." They continued reading. The letter spoke of a place protected for generations. It mentioned people who had risked everything to keep a secret hidden. However, the document ended abruptly. Several pages were missing. "It seems someone removed part of the letter," Alex said. "Do you think Evelyn hid them?" "It's possible." That night they continued reviewing materials until dark. Before leaving, Alex looked at one of the hand-drawn maps. He spread it on the table. "Look at this." He pointed to a series of repeated marks around the property. Eleanor leaned closer. "What do they mean?" "I'm not sure, but they don't seem random." Alex compared that map with other documents. After several minutes, he found coincidences. The marks pointed to specific spots distributed across different areas of the property. It was as if someone had wanted to indicate a route. Over the next few days, Eleanor and Alex began to work together regularly. Every morning they reviewed documents. Every afternoon they explored different areas of the property. The relationship between them began to strengthen. Alex admired Eleanor's determination. Eleanor appreciated the young historian's patience and enthusiasm. Meanwhile, in the city, Richard began to receive news about Eleanor's activities. An old acquaintance told him that the widow spent a lot of time investigating historical documents with a local researcher. At first, Richard didn't pay much attention. He remained convinced that those lands had no value. However, the information lingered in his mind. Something felt strange to him. Why would a woman like Eleanor spend so many hours reviewing old papers? While Richard began to ask himself questions, Eleanor made an even more important discovery. One afternoon, while moving an old bookshelf in Evelyn's study, she found a hidden compartment inside the wall. It wasn't large. It could barely hold a few documents. With trembling hands, she took out the contents. There were several sealed envelopes and a notebook much more deteriorated than the previous ones. Alex arrived just as she finished opening the hideaway. Both looked at the documents. The notebook seemed especially important. The first page contained a phrase written by Evelyn. "If you are reading this, it means you finally found the right path." Eleanor felt her heart begin to beat strongly. She turned the page. The following sheets contained detailed records of years of research. Evelyn had collected testimonies, copies of documents, and references to events that occurred long before her birth. Some notes spoke of families who lost land. Others mentioned irregularly conducted operations decades ago. Everything seemed to be part of the same story, a story they still couldn't fully comprehend. However, upon reaching a page near the end, they found something that left them completely still. Evelyn had drawn a diagram of the property. Below the drawing appeared a phrase circled in red. "Don't just look in the house. The truth is under the ground." For several seconds, no one said a word. Silence filled the room. Eleanor looked at the drawing again and again. For the first time since arriving in Harmony Creek, she had the feeling that she was approaching something enormous, something Evelyn had tried to protect her entire life, and something that for some reason had waited until now to come to light. For several minutes, Eleanor and Alex remained motionless in front of Mrs. Evelyn's notebook. The phrase written on that page seemed to observe them from the aged paper. "Don't just look in the house. The truth is under the ground." Eleanor reread it several times. The more she did, the more convinced she became that Evelyn had left deliberate instructions for whoever inherited the property. It didn't seem like a casual note. It was a message directed at someone who would continue the search. Alex took a slow breath and re-examined the drawing accompanying the phrase. It was a diagram of the property viewed from above. There were several marks made with red ink. Some coincided with the points they had already seen on the maps found earlier. However, now something new appeared, a line connecting different areas of the property, as if indicating a specific route. Eleanor brought a lamp closer to the table to better observe the details. The line began near the main house, moved towards the old barn, and ended in a remote area, where only remnants of a collapsed structure remained. Alex traced his finger over the paper without touching it directly. He said it looked like a route designed to find something hidden. Eleanor felt a mix of excitement and nerves. She had come to Harmony Creek seeking tranquility, but every day she discovered new mysteries. The next morning they decided to follow the map's directions. The sun was barely beginning to illuminate the property when they left the house. Eleanor carried a copy of the drawing. Alex carried a notebook where he had noted observations from the documents. They started at the first point marked near an old stone fence. Upon arrival, they found nothing special, just dry earth, some wild plants, and very old wood debris. Still, Alex insisted on carefully examining the place. After several minutes, he discovered something strange. A stone had initials engraved on it, almost erased by time. They didn't seem recent. Eleanor took a photograph while Alex noted the exact location. They continued to move forward. The second point was next to a huge tree that had probably been growing there for decades. Near the roots, they found a rusty metal object. After cleaning it a bit, they discovered it was an old plaque with engraved numbers. Neither understood what they meant. However, it was evident that someone had placed it there intentionally. As they advanced along the route, the puzzle pieces began to multiply. None offered clear answers, but all seemed connected. Around noon, they reached the old barn. Since Eleanor had arrived at the property, that structure had piqued her curiosity. Although it was deteriorated, it still retained part of its original structure. The doors remained closed by a thick, rusty chain. Alex managed to open it after several attempts. When the doors yielded, a cloud of dust rose into the air. The interior was dark and full of abandoned objects. There were old tools, broken furniture, and boxes accumulated over years. As they explored the place, Eleanor remembered one of the photographs found in the house. In it, several people appeared posing in front of the same barn many decades ago. At the time, she hadn't given it importance, but now she began to wonder who those people really were. For over an hour, they searched the interior without finding anything relevant. Eleanor was starting to think that perhaps they were following a wrong lead when Alex called her attention. He had found something under an old, dusty table. It was a mark engraved on the concrete floor. It had exactly the same shape as one of the symbols drawn on Evelyn's map. They exchanged a look. This could no longer be a coincidence. Alex began to carefully inspect the area. After several minutes, he discovered a small difference in the floor. One section seemed to have been built with different materials. Eleanor felt her heart beat faster. They looked for tools and began to remove some objects that blocked the area. The work was exhausting. They spent hours moving boxes, wood, and remnants of old machinery. When they finally cleared the space completely, they found an old metal trapdoor almost invisible under a layer of hardened dirt. Eleanor was speechless. Alex couldn't hide his excitement either. It took them several minutes to open it because the mechanism was completely rusted. Finally, the lid yielded with a loud noise. Beneath it appeared a narrow cavity. It wasn't very deep, but someone had built it deliberately. Eleanor illuminated the interior with a flashlight. There they found several sealed metal containers. They carefully pulled them out and placed them on the ground. One by one, they began to open them. Inside were documents protected by several layers of cloth. Although time had left its marks, much of the content was still legible. Eleanor observed the first pages with growing astonishment. They were extremely old property records. Some dated back to the late 19th century, others belonged to the early years of the 20th century. Alex began to review them carefully. His expression changed immediately. He said those documents could be very important. Several pages contained official maps, notarial signatures, and references to families in the region. The most surprising discovery was that many names coincided with those appearing in Evelyn's letters. For the next few hours, they remained seated inside the barn, reviewing each page. Slowly, a story began to emerge. It seemed that certain properties had changed hands under unclear circumstances decades ago. There were references to sales made under pressure, mysteriously disappeared legal disputes, and suddenly transferred land. Eleanor felt that she was only seeing a small part of something much larger. However, the most unsettling discovery came late in the afternoon. Inside the last container, they found a map different from all the others. It was much more detailed. It showed not only the current property but also a huge expanse of land that covered several nearby areas. In one corner appeared a note written by Evelyn. The handwriting was somewhat shaky, as if it had been written in her last years of life. The note said that the key to everything was under those lands, and that those who knew the truth would try to keep it. Eleanor felt a chill. Alex remained silent for several seconds, observing the message. Then he pointed to a specific part of the map. There was an area marked with red ink that perfectly matched a remote section of the property that neither of them had explored yet. It wasn't near the house or the barn. It was much further away, near some dry hills that could be seen from the property. Eleanor asked what he thought it meant. Alex replied that it was still impossible to know, but he was convinced that Evelyn had left a deliberate path. Every clue seemed to lead to that place. When they finally left the barn, the sun was already beginning to set. The sky over Harmony Creek was tinged with orange as a gentle breeze swept across the land. Eleanor looked into the distance and located the hills marked on the map. For some reason, she couldn't stop looking at them. She felt that something important awaited them there, something Evelyn had protected for decades. As they slowly returned to the main house, neither of them noticed that several miles away, Richard had just received a call. One of the men he had hired to discreetly monitor Eleanor's movements had just informed him that she and a local historian had been investigating old documents and exploring the property for days. Richard frowned. Until then, he had considered those activities a simple waste of time, but Eleanor's persistence was beginning to seem suspicious. For the first time, he began to wonder if that inheritance hid something more than everyone had imagined. And as that doubt began to grow in his mind, Eleanor carefully stored the new map, unaware that every step she took brought her not only closer to a secret buried under the ground, but also to the biggest conflict she would face in her entire life. The day after the discovery in the barn, Eleanor woke with a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. Since arriving in Harmony Creek, each day seemed to bring a new question, a new clue, or a new surprise. However, what was found the previous afternoon was different. It was no longer just ancient letters or memories kept by Mrs. Evelyn. Now they had documents hidden underground, maps that seemed to point to specific places, and records that spoke of strange property movements that had occurred many years ago. As she prepared coffee in the kitchen, she looked out the window at the hills marked on the map. That area was at the back of the property, beyond the spaces she had explored so far. Something told her that sooner or later she would have to go there, but first, she needed to better understand what they already had in hand. Shortly after, Alex arrived. He brought with him several copies of some historical documents he had consulted overnight. As soon as he entered the house, he placed everything on the table and began to review the notes he had prepared. "I found some interesting coincidences," he said as he arranged several papers. Eleanor sat down opposite him. "About what?" "About the families that appear in the documents hidden in the barn." Alex opened a folder and pointed to several names. Many of them coincided with old records of the region. Some families had disappeared over time. Others still had descendants in nearby towns. But what caught Eleanor's attention most was something else. Several records showed property changes that occurred in very short periods. Lands that had belonged to one family for generations suddenly passed into the hands of other people. In many cases, no clear explanations appeared. "Was that normal?" Eleanor asked. Alex shook his head. "Not necessarily. Then it means someone had a strong interest in controlling certain lands." That answer left Eleanor thoughtful. It wasn't proof of anything, but it fit too well with Evelyn's warnings. Over the next few hours, they continued studying the documents. As they progressed, they began to notice something that had previously gone unnoticed. The areas marked on several old maps coincided with regions where underground water currents existed. Alex found geological references in some historical archives. They weren't complete studies, but they were enough to spark his curiosity. "Look at this," he said as he showed her a yellowed sheet. The document spoke of springs found decades ago in different parts of the region. Eleanor looked at the map. Some symbols seemed to point to areas near Harmony Creek. "Do you think it's related to our land?" "I don't know yet, but I'm considering it." Alex nodded. Yes, that possibility began to haunt both their minds. However, they still had no concrete evidence. Meanwhile, several miles away, Richard was starting to lose patience. The information he received from his contacts was becoming stranger and stranger. He knew Eleanor was still investigating. He knew she spent hours reviewing documents with a historian, and he knew that both were constantly exploring different areas of the property. All of that was starting to seem suspicious to him. One afternoon, he decided to call Eleanor directly. She saw the name on the phone screen and felt immediate discomfort. "Still," she answered. Richard began the conversation with exaggerated cordiality. He asked how she was. He asked what life was like in Harmony Creek. He asked if she needed financial help. Eleanor immediately sensed that it wasn't sincere. After several minutes of superficial conversation, Richard finally got to the point that interested him. "And what do you plan to do with that land?" "I don't know yet. It must be complicated to maintain such a large property. I'm managing. If you ever want to sell, we could help you." Eleanor smiled slightly. That offer came too soon. "Thank you, Richard. I'll keep it in mind." When the call ended, she felt even more distrust. Richard had never shown interest in helping her, so why now? That same night, she decided not to tell him anything about the discoveries. Something inside her told her to be cautious. The following days were full of work. Eleanor and Alex began to explore different areas of the property using the old maps as a guide. Some areas showed nothing special, others contained remnants of abandoned structures. On several occasions, they found stones marked with symbols similar to those seen in the documents. Each discovery reinforced the feeling that Evelyn had left a carefully designed path. One particularly hot morning, they reached an area near the hills. The terrain was drier than the rest. At first glance, It seemed like a worthless place. However, Alex noticed something curious. The vegetation in certain spots was different. Some plants grew more intensely. There were small areas where the earth retained moisture even after several days without rain. He knelt to examine the soil. Then he looked around. "This isn't normal. What's going on?" Eleanor asked. "There might be water nearby." Eleanor felt a slight jolt. Underground water. That possibility made them both continue investigating the area. For several hours they took notes and compared the information with the maps. The more they analyzed the data, the more sense certain references found in Evelyn's documents made. They weren't just talking about land, they seemed to be talking about something hidden beneath it. That afternoon, Alex decided to contact an old acquaintance who worked in geological studies. He didn't explain too much over the phone, just asked for a professional opinion on some observations. The specialist agreed to visit the property a few days later. While they waited, Eleanor continued cleaning parts of the house that still remained closed. In a second-floor room, she found several forgotten boxes. Inside were more old photographs. Some showed family gatherings, others portrayed landscapes of the property decades ago. However, one image particularly caught her attention. It showed Evelyn alongside several unknown men observing an excavation. The photograph was ancient, very ancient. On the back, someone had written a date and a brief phrase, "The first hint." Eleanor remained observing the image for a long time. She didn't know exactly what it meant, but it seemed like another piece of the same puzzle. 2 days later, the geologist arrived. He was a man named Dr. Stephen Miller. He visited different points of the property accompanied by Eleanor and Alex. He took samples, made measurements, observed the vegetation, examined the soil composition. The process lasted several hours. At the end, he asked for some time to review the information. He promised to return with a more precise opinion. That wait became endless. Meanwhile, Richard continued to accumulate doubts. Eleanor's evasive answers unsettled him. Each new piece of news increased his curiosity. Finally, he made a decision. He hired someone to discreetly monitor movements around the property. He wanted to know exactly what was happening. He didn't imagine that decision would mark the beginning of a much larger conflict. 3 days later, Stephen returned. As soon as he arrived, Eleanor noticed that he seemed excited. Alex also immediately perceived that he brought important news. They met at the main table in the house. The geologist placed several documents in front of them. Then he took a deep breath before speaking. "There's something very interesting under these lands." Neither said a word. "What did you find?" Alex asked. Stephen pointed to several graphs. He explained that the geological conditions of the area were unusual. There were clear indications of underground water currents, but it wasn't common water. The observed characteristics suggested something much more valuable. "We need more complete studies to confirm it," he continued. "Confirm what?" Eleanor asked. Stephen smiled. "The possibility of a hot spring." For a few seconds, silence filled the room. Eleanor felt her heart begin to race. She had heard of places famous for their hot springs. She knew that many people traveled great distances to visit them, but she never imagined that something like that could exist under those lands that everyone considered useless. Alex looked at the documents once more. The pieces were starting to fit together. The maps, Evelyn's investigations, the marks scattered across the property, the warnings, everything seemed to point in the same direction. And as Eleanor tried to assimilate that possibility, far from Harmony Creek, Richard received a report from his lookout. The man explained that specialists had started visiting the property. He mentioned soil studies, technical inspections, constant surveys. Richard remained silent for several seconds. For the first time, he stopped thinking that Eleanor was wasting her time. For the first time, he felt something he rarely experienced: concern. Because if so many specialized people were appearing on those abandoned lands, it meant that perhaps something existed there, something he still didn't know about. And Richard hated not knowing what could generate money. The news Stephen had just given them hung in the air for several seconds. Eleanor looked at the documents on the table as she tried to process what she had just heard. A hot spring. Those words seemed too grand for a property that everyone had considered useless for years. Alex was the first to break the silence. He asked Stephen to explain exactly how reliable the results were. The geologist picked up one of the reports and began to point out several pieces of data. He explained that more in-depth studies were still needed to confirm everything with absolute certainty, but the indications were very strong. The characteristics of the terrain, the soil composition, and certain geological records pointed to the existence of thermal water under part of the property. Eleanor listened attentively. The more Stephen spoke, the more she understood that this could change everything. For decades, that land had remained forgotten. It had been a source of ridicule. Even she herself had arrived thinking it was a worthless old house. Now she was beginning to understand why Evelyn had dedicated so many years to investigating those lands. Perhaps she had discovered something she never managed to fully reveal. After several hours of conversation, Stephen left, leaving copies of the preliminary reports. When they were alone, Eleanor and Alex continued to analyze all the information. On the table were old maps, Evelyn's letters, photographs found in the house, and the new geological studies. Slowly, the pieces began to fit together. Alex picked up one of the old photographs, where Evelyn appeared observing an excavation with several men. He placed it next to one of the maps. Then he pointed to a specific area. Eleanor leaned closer to look better. It was exactly the same sector where the studies showed greater underground activity. Neither said anything for a few moments. Both were thinking the same thing. Evelyn had probably discovered indications of that spring many years ago. However, for some reason, she never developed the project. The question was, why? During the following days, new explorations began. Stephen returned, accompanied by other specialists. They carried out more precise measurements in different parts of the terrain, set up temporary equipment, and took additional samples. Each result reinforced the same conclusion. The hot spring existed. Not only that, it seemed to be much larger than they had initially imagined. One afternoon, while reviewing recent reports, Stephen smiled in a way Eleanor had not seen before. He explained that the estimated volume of water was extraordinary for a region like that. Furthermore, the recorded temperatures were ideal for tourism projects related to wellness and relaxation. Eleanor remained silent. She immediately remembered the laughter during that family dinner. She remembered Richard's taunts. She remembered Patricia saying that the inheritance perfectly reflected her failure. For the first time in a long time, she felt something other than sadness when she thought about those words. She felt a quiet satisfaction, not because she wanted revenge, but because reality was proving something no one expected. Meanwhile, in Harmony Creek, rumors began to circulate. The workers collaborating in the studies discreetly commented that something important was happening on Eleanor's property. The townspeople began to ask questions. Some showed curiosity, others were skeptical, but everyone was talking about it. Rosie was one of the first to visit her to ask directly if the rumors were true. Eleanor didn't want to hide the truth. She explained that definitive studies were still pending, but that specialists believed they had found a significant hot spring. Rosie's eyes widened in surprise. The news spread through the town much faster than Eleanor imagined. In a matter of days, practically everyone knew the story. Some neighbors began to get excited. Harmony Creek had been facing economic difficulties for years. Many businesses barely survived. Young people continued to leave in search of better opportunities. The possibility that the region would attract visitors generated hope. Eleanor began to notice something new in conversations with the locals. For the first time since her arrival, people spoke of the future with enthusiasm. However, not everyone received the news with joy. Several miles away, Richard was sitting in his office when he received a call from one of the men discreetly monitoring the property. The report was brief but enough to change his expression. They had found something valuable under the land. They didn't have all the details, but specialists kept arriving, and the studies continued to advance. Richard remained motionless for several seconds. Then he asked for all available information. That same night he began to investigate on his own. At first, he thought it might be some agricultural resource or a minor project, but as he obtained more data, he began to comprehend the magnitude of the situation. A hot spring could turn a forgotten property into a multi-million-dollar business. The news caused him a mix of disbelief and greed. He couldn't accept that Eleanor, precisely Eleanor, had inherited something so valuable. For years he had considered her a woman without influence, without resources, and without the capacity to compete with the Sterling family. Now the situation was completely different. 2 days later, Richard unexpectedly appeared in Harmony Creek. Eleanor saw him arrive from the house window. She didn't need to hear a single word to understand why he was there. When she opened the door, Richard displayed a forced, overly kind smile. He said he had decided to visit her to see how she was adapting to life in the town. Eleanor almost had to suppress a laugh. He had never shown interest in her well-being. Still, she invited him in. During the conversation, Richard avoided directly mentioning the hot spring. He spoke of investments, he spoke of opportunities, he spoke of future businesses. Finally, he got to the topic that really interested him. He asked if she had considered selling part of the land. Eleanor replied no. Richard insisted. He commented that managing such a large property could be complicated. He suggested that certain decisions should be made quickly to avoid problems. Eleanor listened to every word without revealing anything. The more Richard spoke, the more evident it became that he already knew part of the truth. After almost an hour, he left without getting any useful information, but before getting into his car, he looked at the property for several seconds. Eleanor managed to notice the expression on his face. He no longer saw an abandoned property. He saw money, a lot of money. That same week, the first informal offers began to arrive. Entrepreneurs interested in tourism projects requested meetings. Investors asked about the studies. Even some regional authorities showed interest in learning about the progress. Eleanor felt overwhelmed at times. Just a few months ago, she was being pressured to leave a house they no longer wanted her to inhabit. Now people from different places were trying to approach her. Fortunately, Alex remained by her side, helping her calmly analyze each proposal. One afternoon, while reviewing new documents from Evelyn, they found a note that immediately caught their attention. It was written in a notebook much more recent than the others. The phrase was brief: "When they discover the water, the real problems will begin." Eleanor and Alex exchanged a look. Those words seemed like a direct warning. Evelyn knew perfectly well what would happen once the secret came to light. And she was right, because while the residents of Harmony Creek began to dream of new opportunities, while specialists confirmed more and more data about the hot spring, and while Eleanor tried to comprehend the magnitude of it all, Richard was already planning his next move. He had stopped wondering if those lands had value. Now he was focused on a single idea: finding a way to claim a part of what he considered an unexpected fortune. And for the first time since James's death, Eleanor was about to become an obstacle for someone accustomed to always getting what he wanted. In the days following the confirmation of the hot spring, Eleanor's life changed in a way she never would have imagined. Just a few weeks ago, most of the people who were part of the Sterling family treated her as a burden. No one asked how she was. No one seemed interested in her problems. Now the exact opposite was happening. Her phone started ringing frequently. Relatives who hadn't called her in years suddenly appeared to greet her. Some asked about her health. Others were curious about life in Harmony Creek. Everyone tried to appear close. Eleanor listened to those conversations calmly, but also with distrust. She had lived too many years surrounded by those people not to recognize when someone was acting out of self-interest. One morning, she received a call from Patricia, her mother-in-law. The woman spoke with a sweetness that was almost unrecognizable. She asked if she was eating well. She asked if she felt lonely. She said the family missed her. Eleanor remained silent for several seconds. Those same people had spent years making her feel that she didn't belong in their world. Now they seemed desperate to show affection. When the call ended, Eleanor put the phone on the table and let out a small smile. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was the smile of someone who perfectly understands what is happening. That same afternoon, Alex arrived at the house with several new folders. He had spent much of the week consulting historical archives in different counties of the region. The investigations continued to advance, and each new document seemed to deepen the story that Evelyn had been pursuing for decades. While reviewing the material, Alex found something interesting. Several references mentioned conflicts related to rural properties that occurred many years ago. They were not isolated cases. There was a pattern. Entire families had lost land under unclear circumstances. Some disappeared from records, others ended up selling their properties for absurdly low amounts. Eleanor observed the documents with growing curiosity. The feeling that everything was connected increased every day. However, important pieces were still missing. They still couldn't explain why Evelyn had dedicated so many years to gathering that information, nor why she had decided to leave everything to her specifically. 2 days later, an unexpected visit arrived. Eleanor was working in the garden when she heard the sound of several vehicles approaching along the main road. As she looked up, she saw something that left her still. It was Edward, Patricia, and Richard. They didn't come alone. Other relatives also accompanied them. All descended from their cars, displaying exaggerated smiles. Eleanor immediately felt an indescribable discomfort. These people had never visited the property since her arrival, and now they suddenly appeared, almost as if they were on a family outing. Patricia was the first to approach. She hugged her with an effusiveness that would have been unthinkable months ago. Edward also showed a completely new kindness. Richard, of course, smiled more than anyone. For several minutes, they toured the property while making seemingly friendly comments. They praised the landscape, talked about future possibilities, congratulated Eleanor on her good fortune. Everything sounded artificial. Everything seemed rehearsed. Finally, they got to the topic that really interested them. While observing an area near the hills, Richard commented that developing a tourist project would require an enormous investment. Edward added that managing something so large could be complicated for a single person. Patricia suggested that the family could help. Eleanor listened to every word without interrupting. She already knew where the conversation was heading. Richard was the one who ended up saying what everyone was thinking. He proposed forming a partnership. According to him, the Sterling family had business experience and could handle the business side. Eleanor would only have to contribute the land. Alex, who had arrived shortly before and was discreetly observing the situation, remained silent. He wanted to see how she would react. Eleanor took a few seconds to respond, then thanked them for the offer, but made it clear that she had no intention of making hasty decisions. Richard's smile tightened for just an instant, only a second, but Eleanor noticed it. That brief reaction confirmed what she suspected. They hadn't traveled to Harmony Creek to see her. They had traveled for the land. After several hours, the family returned to the city. However, the visits didn't end there. Over the following weeks, they began to appear constantly. Sometimes they arrived with gifts, other times with business proposals. They even organized impromptu family meals. It seemed that suddenly everyone remembered how much they appreciated Eleanor. She maintained her politeness but didn't let her guard down. Meanwhile, Alex continued to advance in the investigation. One afternoon, he found a particularly important clue. It all started with a letter written by Evelyn many years ago. The letter was addressed to a person named Julian Caldwell. Until then, that name had appeared several times in different documents, but they had never managed to understand its relevance. Alex decided to investigate further. After several days of reviewing historical archives, he discovered that Julian Caldwell had been a descendant of one of the families mentioned repeatedly in property records. The information seemed important, but what was truly surprising appeared afterward. Among the documents associated with that family, references emerged to certain land extensions that coincided exactly with areas currently controlled by the Sterlings. Alex felt he was getting closer to something big. When he showed the findings to Eleanor, both began to connect information. The names, the dates, the property movements, the letters. Everything seemed to be part of the same story, a story that still remained incomplete. That same night, while reviewing new folders, they found another note written by Evelyn. The handwriting was firm, as if she wanted to leave a very clear warning. The phrase said, "They will not be content with the water. When they understand what these lands truly hide, they will try to take everything." Eleanor reread those words several times. The feeling of uneasiness was immediate. Until then, the hot spring seemed to be the main point of interest. But Evelyn was suggesting something different, something even more important, something that remained hidden. The next day, Alex proposed reviewing the documents found in the barn again. Perhaps they had overlooked a clue. They spent hours classifying papers, comparing maps, reviewing old notes. When they were beginning to feel exhausted, something unexpected happened. Inside a deteriorated folder, an envelope appeared that they had never opened. It had been stuck between several documents. Eleanor observed it with curiosity. The envelope was sealed. It seemed to have remained closed for decades. Very carefully, she opened it. Inside, she found several folded sheets. The first contained a list of names. The second showed references to rural properties. The third was the one that truly caught her attention. It was a map different from all the previous ones, more detailed, more precise, and accompanied by several annotations made by Evelyn. Alex spread the document on the table. Both began to examine it. In one corner, a mark appeared surrounded by red ink. Next to it, Evelyn had written a phrase, "Look beneath the original structures." That indication immediately raised new questions. What structure was she referring to? The house, the barn, some disappeared construction? As they tried to find answers, Eleanor remembered something. During her first days in Harmony Creek, she had seen the remains of an old structure near a remote area of the property. Only a few stones remained. At the time, she hadn't given it importance. Now it began to seem relevant. Alex suggested visiting the place the next day. Perhaps they would find new clues. That night, Eleanor had difficulty sleeping. She couldn't stop thinking about Evelyn's words. Nor could she ignore the Sterlings' recent behavior. Something was changing, and not just because of the hot spring. Richard's obsession seemed to grow every day. The constant visits, the insistent proposals, the false kindness. Everything indicated that he was planning something. Far away in the city, Richard remained seated in his office, looking at various reports on the property. He had hired private specialists to investigate the economic potential of the land. The results were even more promising than he imagined. The The projected figures were enormous, but there was something else that caught his attention. One of his investigators mentioned the existence of historical documents linked to the property, documents that Eleanor and Alex had been reviewing for months. Richard frowned. He didn't understand why those old papers seemed so important. However, he knew a business rule well. When someone protects something so carefully, it's usually because it's worth much more than it appears. And at that moment, as he looked at the reports spread across his desk, he made a silent decision. He was no longer going to limit himself to convincing Eleanor. He was going to find out exactly what she was hiding, and once he knew, he would do everything necessary to obtain it. The next morning, Eleanor and Alex left early for the area where the remains of that forgotten structure they had identified on Mrs. Evelyn's map were located. The sky was clear, and a light breeze swept across the grounds, but neither of them paid much attention to the scenery. Both were focused on the new clue. The words written by Evelyn still resonated in their minds. Look beneath the original structures. Throughout the journey, Eleanor couldn't help but think about how her life had changed in such a short time. She had arrived in Harmony Creek seeking a place to start anew after years of humiliations, and now she found herself following traces of family secrets buried for generations. When they arrived at the designated spot, they found only a few scattered stones and remnants of foundations covered by dirt and vegetation. At first glance, it seemed impossible for anything important to be there. However, Evelyn's documents had proven too many times that nothing should be ruled out. Alex began to carefully examine the terrain. He walked slowly, observing every detail. Eleanor helped him by removing some dry branches and small stones. After almost an hour of searching, they found something strange. A part of the ground sounded different when struck with a metal tool. It wasn't a solid sound like the rest. It was hollow. Both looked at each other immediately. Excitement appeared on their faces. Patiently, they began to remove soil. The work was slow and exhausting. The sun climbed higher and higher in the sky as they continued digging. Finally, a very deteriorated wooden surface appeared. It looked like an old lid buried under decades of accumulated earth. Eleanor felt her heart beating strongly. Between the two of them, they removed the remaining soil that covered it. After several minutes, they managed to lift it. Beneath it, they found a small hidden space. It wasn't a room or a tunnel. Rather, it seemed like a hiding place built to protect something specific. Inside were several metal boxes. Some were heavily damaged by time, but others remained surprisingly well preserved. Eleanor carefully took one of them. They placed it on a flat surface and began to open it. Inside, they found documents wrapped in old cloths. Alex reviewed the first pages, and his expression immediately changed. This was unlike anything they had found before. They were legal records, contracts, and original deeds. There were official seals, signatures, and notarial documents from different eras. Eleanor observed each page without yet understanding its importance. Alex quickly began to organize the papers. The more he read, the more surprised he seemed. After several minutes, he looked up. His face reflected disbelief. Eleanor asked him what was happening. Alex took a few seconds to respond. Finally, he explained that those documents seemed to prove that a large amount of land in the region had originally belonged to several farming families before passing into the hands of businessmen and landowners. That in itself was interesting, but what was truly impactful was another detail. Many of the names that appeared in the transfers coincided with the surnames that had surfaced repeatedly throughout the investigation. Eleanor felt a chill. As they continued reviewing documents, something even more important appeared. A folder protected within a special cover. It was clearly separated from the rest, as if Evelyn had wanted to highlight its content. Alex opened it with extreme care. Inside, they found copies of complaints, witness statements, and private correspondence related to purchase operations carried out decades ago. Slowly, a dark story began to unfold. Several families had been pressured to sell their land for ridiculous sums. Others had lost properties after facing strange legal problems. Some even appeared linked to threats and maneuvers designed to force them to leave the region. Eleanor felt that each page increased the tension, but the biggest shock came a few minutes later. Among those documents appeared a name she knew perfectly well, Sterling. It wasn't an isolated reference. The surname appeared repeatedly in different records. Alex continued reading in silence. The further he read, the more serious the situation seemed. Finally, he found several documents that directly connected Edward Sterling's ancestors with operations related to the acquisition of enormous tracts of land. Many of those operations coincided with the complaints and claims present in the same folder. Eleanor remained still. For years, she had heard stories about how the Sterling family had built their fortune through smart business deals and entrepreneurial effort. Now, a completely different version of events was beginning to emerge, a version that no one had ever told her. They continued reviewing the material for hours. The evidence was abundant. It wasn't rumors or mere suspicions. There were official records, signatures, statements, and historical documents. Everything pointed in the same direction. The Sterling's initial fortune seemed to have grown thanks to land obtained through very questionable practices. However, the biggest surprise was yet to come. Inside one of the last folders, they found a family tree created by Mrs. Evelyn. Eleanor observed it with curiosity. There were names she recognized and others completely unknown. Alex began to follow the family lines marked on the document. Suddenly, he pointed to a specific name, then another. Then he looked up at Eleanor. His expression was different, more serious, more intense. He explained that some of the families who appeared as victims of those operations had ties to her own ancestors. Eleanor felt the air seem to disappear for an instant. Alex continued reviewing the information to ensure he made no mistakes. He compared dates, names, and records. He finally reached the same conclusion. Part of the lands that had been taken decades ago belonged to Eleanor's relatives. That revelation left her completely stunned. Her entire life she had thought she came from a humble family, with no connection to the grand stories of power that surrounded the Sterlings. Now she discovered that there was a much deeper link than she ever imagined. She remained seated in silence, trying to process everything. The mockery, the scorn, the years feeling inferior to that family. Everything took on a new dimension. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Richard continued to investigate on his own. The reports he received about the property kept coming. He knew Eleanor and Alex were finding old documents. He knew they had discovered something important, but he still didn't know exactly what it was. That uncertainty was starting to drive him to despair. He decided to increase surveillance on the property and hire specialists to track any available information about the history of those lands. He was convinced that there was something valuable hidden behind it all, and he was not willing to be left out. Back in Harmony Creek, Eleanor and Alex continued organizing the documents they found. The discovery was too important to act hastily. They needed to verify every piece of data. They needed to fully understand the story before taking any steps. However, both knew they had just crossed a line. They were no longer just investigating a hot spring or a mysterious inheritance. They had found evidence that could change the perception of an entire family. Evidence that questioned the origin of a fortune built over generations. When the sun began to set behind the hills, Eleanor looked at the open boxes in front of her. It had all started with an old house that everyone considered a ruin. Now, she had before her eyes documents capable of shaking the foundations of the most powerful family she had ever known. And for the first time since beginning that search, she understood that Mrs. Evelyn was not just trying to protect a piece of land or a hot spring. She had spent decades gathering evidence because she wanted the truth to come to light someday, and that day was getting closer and closer. The days that followed the discovery of the hidden documents were completely different from anything Eleanor had experienced since arriving in Harmony Creek. Until then, the investigation had been full of questions, clues, and surprising findings. But now there was something much more concrete. The evidence found beneath that abandoned structure showed a history that no one in the Sterling family would have wanted to come to light. Eleanor and Alex knew they had to act carefully. They couldn't rush or make mistakes. Every document had to be reviewed, classified, and verified. Too much was at stake. One morning, while organizing some of the material found, Alex arrived at the house with a worried expression. As soon as he crossed the threshold, Eleanor noticed something was wrong. He placed a folder on the table and sat down without saying anything for several seconds. Finally, he explained that he had found strange movements in some recent records related to the property. Eleanor frowned. She didn't understand what he meant. Alex opened the folder and showed her several copies of documents obtained from public offices. According to those records, someone had started filing claims related to certain property boundaries. Eleanor felt an immediate sense of alarm. She didn't know anyone who could have rights to those lands. Then Alex uttered the name she feared to hear, Richard. For a few seconds, silence filled the room. Eleanor closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She wasn't surprised. Ever since the news about the hot spring began to spread, she knew Richard would try something. What she hadn't imagined was that he would act so quickly. Alex explained that the claims seemed to be part of a strategy to question the validity of some property documents. At first glance, they might seem like normal administrative procedures, but there were too many coincidences to ignore them. Eleanor looked at the papers carefully. Each page increased her concern. This was not a simple bureaucratic nuisance. It was the beginning of a carefully planned offensive. That same afternoon, she received a call from a lawyer hired by Richard. The man spoke with professional courtesy, but the message was clear. There were alleged irregularities related to certain territorial limits, and it would be advisable to review the situation before major problems arose. Eleanor ended the conversation with a mix of indignation and frustration. For years, Richard had ignored those lands. He had participated in the mockery, had said that the inheritance was little more than trash. Now he was trying to appropriate it. Alex recommended she seek immediate legal advice. Eleanor accepted. In the following days, meetings began with lawyers specializing in rural property. While they analyzed the documents, an even more worrying piece of news emerged. Some recently registered copies contained suspicious signatures and contradictory references. One of the lawyers was direct in expressing his opinion. There were clear indications of document forgery. Those words completely changed the situation. It was no longer just a family dispute. If the suspicions were true, someone was manipulating official documents to take land that didn't belong to them. Eleanor felt a mix of anger and disappointment. As much as she distrusted Richard, she never imagined he would go so far. Meanwhile, in Harmony Creek, rumors grew every day. The townspeople began to learn about the conflict. Many knew Eleanor since her arrival. They had seen her work to restore the property. They had witnessed the studies related to the hot spring. Slowly, people began to take sides. Rosie was one of the first to openly show support. Then came other neighbors. Some offered practical help. Others shared stories about similar conflicts that had occurred years ago. Eleanor was surprised to discover how much support she had among people she barely knew a few months earlier. Unlike the Sterling family, these people did not expect to gain personal benefits. They simply considered what was happening unjust. As local support grew, Richard intensified his movements, hired new lawyers, filed more claims, and began spreading the version that there were legitimate doubts about the ownership of certain lands. He also tried to approach Eleanor again. He sent messages proposing friendly agreements, suggested private negotiations, even offered to buy part of the property for seemingly generous amounts. Eleanor rejected every proposal. She no longer trusted him. Every friendly gesture seemed to hide a different intention. One night, while reviewing documents with Alex, something unexpected happened. They heard noises near the old barn. At first, they thought it was animals. However, the sounds continued. Alex took a flashlight and went to investigate. Eleanor accompanied him. When they arrived at the place, they discovered that someone had tried to get in. One of the locks had been forced. Several boxes had been moved. It didn't seem like a common robbery. There were too many coincidences. The intruders seemed to be looking for something specific. Eleanor felt a chill. The documents found there contained extremely sensitive information. If someone was trying to access them, it meant that the investigation was starting to make powerful people uncomfortable. Alex immediately notified local authorities. They also took steps to better protect all the material. Part of the documents was moved to secure locations. Another part was digitized. No one wanted to take risks. As the weeks passed, the tension increased. Eleanor's lawyers gathered evidence of the irregularities detected in the claims filed by Richard. At the same time, Alex continued to investigate the history behind the documents found by Evelyn. Each new discovery reinforced the importance of that evidence. The history of the lands was not a minor matter. It could directly affect the reputation of people who for decades had been considered respectable and successful. One afternoon, Eleanor received news that deeply disturbed her. One of the lawyers confirmed that several signatures used in recent documents did not match the original records. The differences were evident. There were sufficient elements to request a formal investigation. Eleanor then understood that the conflict had entered a new stage. It was no longer just a dispute over land. It was a battle for the truth. Meanwhile, Richard was beginning to feel pressured. His plans were not progressing as quickly as he hoped. He had assumed that Eleanor would yield to the first difficulties. He had thought that a 60-year-old woman would eventually accept some convenient agreement. But the reality turned out to be very different. Every time he tried to advance, he met resistance. Every new maneuver generated more questions. And to make matters worse, the residents of Harmony Creek openly supported Eleanor. This situation fueled his frustration. One night, meeting with some advisors, he expressed his anger with a clarity that surprised even those who worked for him. He said that those lands should be in the hands of people capable of exploiting them correctly. He said that Eleanor did not understand the real value of what she had. He said that sooner or later he would find a way to regain control. However, the more he insisted, the more evident something he tried to hide even from himself became. He was no longer acting solely for money. He was also acting out of pride. He couldn't stand the idea that Eleanor had found something so valuable. He couldn't stand to see her succeed after years of considering her inferior. Back in Harmony Creek, Eleanor was watching the sunset from the porch of the house when Alex arrived with new information. He had found additional data related to old property records. Some important pieces were starting to fit together. The investigation was moving in a direction neither of them had anticipated at the beginning, and the closer they got to the complete truth, the more dangerous the path became. Eleanor listened attentively as the sky slowly darkened over the lands inherited from Evelyn. The war for the lands had already begun, but deep down, she sensed that the legal confrontations were just the beginning of something much bigger, because the secrets buried for decades were starting to surface one after another without anyone being able to stop them. The tension in Harmony Creek increased with each passing day. Eleanor no longer had the tranquility she had arrived with months ago. Since the legal conflicts over the land began, every phone call, every new document, and every unexpected visit seemed to bring a different problem. However, despite the difficulties, she maintained her determination to move forward. She had spent much of her life enduring humiliations and learning to resist difficult times. This time, she wasn't going to back down. Besides, she had something she had never had during the years she lived with the Sterling family, a cause of her own to fight for. Those lands represented much more than an inheritance. They represented the opportunity to recover a part of history that had remained hidden for decades. Meanwhile, Alex continued to advance in the historical investigation. For weeks, he had worked practically non-stop. He visited municipal archives, consulted notarial records, and reviewed old documents in different cities of the region. Each new finding reinforced the conclusions that had begun to emerge from the first discoveries. The properties that now surrounded Harmony Creek were linked to a series of dubious operations carried out many years ago. The documents found by Mrs. Evelyn seemed to show that several families had lost land under very questionable circumstances. One morning, Alex received a call from an old colleague named Scott Miller. They had met years ago on research projects related to regional history. Scott had experience working with old archives and knew several documentary centers that could be useful. When Alex explained part of the investigation, Scott showed great interest. He said he could help. He said he knew places where they might find complementary information. He said he was willing to collaborate. Alex accepted. At first glance, it seemed like excellent news. Over the next few days, Scott began to actively participate in the investigation, reviewing documents, helping to organize files, sharing opinions on different theories. Eleanor also got to know him. He seemed kind, educated, genuinely interested in history. No one suspected anything. Meanwhile, Eleanor's lawyers prepared for an important hearing related to the claims promoted by Richard. The case was progressing slowly, but the evidence of possible irregularities began to strengthen. The historical documents found by Evelyn were becoming increasingly relevant. Some could help explain the origin of certain property conflicts. Others showed connections that no one had imagined. Everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. However, something began to change. First, there were small details. A document that wasn't where it should be. A folder placed in a different spot. A note that no one remembered moving. At first, Eleanor thought it was simply normal errors within such a large investigation. There were hundreds of papers, dozens of boxes, thousands of pages. It was easy to get confused, but the incidents continued and became stranger and stranger. One afternoon, Alex arrived at the house, visibly worried. He had been reviewing several boxes stored in a secure room. Some of the most important pieces had disappeared. These were not just any documents. They were precisely those that established more direct connections between certain historical properties and the operations carried out by the Sterling's ancestors. Eleanor felt an empty pit in her stomach. They immediately began to review everything again. They opened boxes, examined folders, searched every corner. Nothing. The documents had disappeared. The concern quickly turned into alarm. That evidence could be fundamental for future legal actions. Without it, part of the investigation would be weakened. For hours, they tried to find an explanation. Had they been stolen? Had someone broken into the property? Was there a copy? The questions piled up. The answers didn't appear. That same night, Alex began to review access logs, work notes, and photographs taken during previous weeks. He wanted to reconstruct exactly what had happened, As he analyzed the information, he found something that caught his attention. Several of the disappearances coincided with times when Scott had worked alone with some files. At first, he dismissed the idea. It seemed impossible. Scott had actively collaborated for weeks. It made no sense to suspect him, but as he reviewed more details, the coincidences became difficult to ignore. Finally, he decided to speak directly with him. The conversation did not go as he expected. When Alex asked about certain documents, Scott reacted strangely. He avoided answering clearly. He changed the subject several times and shortly after abruptly ended the call. That reaction increased suspicions. Over the next 48 hours, Scott stopped responding to messages. He also stopped answering calls. He seemed to have disappeared. Eleanor began to feel deeply disappointed, not only by the loss of the documents, but also because that person had gained her trust, had shared time with them, had heard important details of the investigation, and now seemed to be fleeing. The situation worsened when a private investigator hired by the lawyers managed to obtain troubling information. Scott had recently received a considerable sum of money. The transfer came from a company indirectly related to one of the business groups that had shown interest in acquiring the land. The news dropped like a bomb. Alex remained silent for several minutes after reading the report. He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was overwhelming. Someone had paid for information, and Scott seemed to have accepted. The betrayal hurt more than either of them expected. Not only had they lost documents, but they had also lost some of the trust they had built over months. However, the main problem remained: the missing evidence. Without it, certain lines of investigation remained incomplete. The lawyers were worried. The important hearing was approaching, and some of the most valuable evidence was no longer available. For several days, Eleanor felt like everything was starting to collapse. For the first time since arriving in Harmony Creek, she experienced a feeling of helplessness. She had fought against mockery, had faced threats. She had endured legal pressures, but this time the blow came from within, from someone they had trusted. One night, she stood alone on the porch of the house, watching the darkness of the property. She thought of Evelyn, she thought of James, she thought of everything that had happened since her arrival. For an instant, she wondered if she could really win that battle, but the next morning something unexpected happened. Alex arrived early. He had a completely different expression. He looked tired, but also excited. He carried several folders under his arm, placed them on the table, and began to explain. After reviewing old digital records, photographs of documents, and partial copies made during previous stages of the investigation, he had found an alternative. He wouldn't recover the exact stolen documents, but he could reconstruct much of the lost information. Moreover, during the search, he had discovered something even more important. Some official archives consulted months ago contained references that they had not considered relevant at the time. Now they took on a completely different meaning. Among them appeared notarial records forgotten for decades, records that confirmed property movements related to the same families mentioned by Evelyn. Eleanor began to feel hope again. They spent the following days working intensely. Alex reviewed hundreds of pages, contacted regional archives, requested certified copies, verified dates and signatures. Slowly, the pieces began to reappear, not exactly as before, but enough to reconstruct the case. And then, an even more unsettling revelation emerged. While comparing old documents, Alex found connections between certain modern businessmen and recent operations related to the hot spring. Some people were not just interested in buying land. They seemed to be coordinating movements to control the entire area. The ambition went far beyond Richard. There were much larger economic interests acting behind the scenes. When Eleanor understood that, she felt that the magnitude of the conflict had just grown again. She no longer faced only an ambitious brother-in-law, nor just a family desperate to regain influence. Now there were business groups watching every move, people with resources, contacts, and power. And if they had been capable of buying the loyalty of someone like Scott, they were probably willing to do much more. As the sun began to set behind the hills of Harmony Creek, Eleanor looked at the folders covering the main table of the house. The betrayal had caused damage, had hampered the investigation, had sown doubt, but it had also revealed something important. The secrets that Evelyn protected for so many years were worth enough for certain people to risk money, reputation, and deceit in order to prevent them from coming to light. And that meant they were much closer to the truth than their enemies wanted to admit. After Scott's betrayal, Eleanor spent several days feeling like she was walking on unstable ground. She had managed to regain some confidence thanks to Alex's work and the new documents found, but she could no longer ignore an evident reality. The people who wanted to control those lands were willing to go much further than she had imagined. Still, she had no intention of giving up. Every time she looked at Mrs. Evelyn's old house, she remembered everything she had discovered since her arrival in Harmony Creek. She remembered the letters, the maps, the hidden records, and the warnings that woman had left scattered for decades. Everything indicated that Evelyn had dedicated much of her life to gathering evidence, so that someday someone could finish the work she failed to conclude. Eleanor felt an enormous responsibility. She was no longer fighting solely for a property, she was fighting for a truth that had remained hidden for too long. Meanwhile, Alex continued working tirelessly. The recovered documents and the new certified copies obtained from different archives began to form a much clearer picture of what had happened decades ago. What were once suspicions now began to become a documented history, with enough backing to attract the attention of authorities and journalists. One morning, while organizing files on the main table of the house, Alex found something he had been looking for weeks. It was a series of notarial records related to land transfers made during a specific period. Those documents showed extraordinary coincidences with several old complaints found by Evelyn. The dates matched, the names matched, even the locations matched. Eleanor observed the papers as Alex explained every detail. The further the explanation progressed, the more evident it became that the operations carried out by certain members of the Sterling family had not been as clean as had always been told. That same afternoon, they made an important decision. Part of the information would be shared with journalists specialized in regional investigations. It was not an impulsive decision. They had spent months verifying data. They had consulted lawyers. They had reviewed documents again and again. They knew that the accusations were serious and that any error could turn against them. However, they also understood that remaining silent would only benefit those who had been hiding the truth for decades. The first journalists arrived in Harmony Creek a few days later, interviewed Eleanor, spoke with Alex, reviewed part of the available documentation. They also talked with townspeople who knew the recent history of the property. What began as a local investigation quickly began to grow. Reporters found enough elements to continue digging deeper. Meanwhile, Richard ignored the magnitude of what was happening. He remained focused on his legal strategies and the private negotiations he was trying to push through intermediaries. He thought he could still control the situation. He thought the conflict would be resolved in court or through financial agreements. What he didn't imagine was that the story was about to leave the offices and reach public knowledge. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning. Eleanor was having breakfast when Rosie rushed into the house. She held a newspaper in her hands. As soon as she crossed the door, she placed the paper on the table. On the front page appeared a headline related to old land operations in the region and possible irregularities linked to highly influential business families. Although the article did not mention all the names directly, the references were enough for anyone to understand who was being talked about. Eleanor read every line carefully. Alex did the same. The report summarized some of the information collected over months. It also mentioned historical documents that questioned the official version of certain business dealings decades ago. That publication was just the beginning. In the following days, new articles appeared. Some delved into specific cases, others interviewed historians and specialists. Gradually, more media outlets became interested in the story. What had remained hidden for generations was beginning to become a topic of conversation throughout the region. The Sterling family's reaction was immediate. Edward exploded with fury upon seeing the first reports. For years, he had built a public image based on respect, success, and prestige. Now that image was beginning to crack. Patricia also didn't know how to react. Accustomed to moving in circles where appearances were fundamental, she watched in horror as old friends began asking uncomfortable questions. But the one who took it worst was Richard. When he read the publications, he felt he was losing control of the situation. He tried to contact journalists, tried to discredit the information, tried to present the story as a smear campaign driven by economic interests. However, the documents spoke for themselves. Every time he denied something, new evidence appeared. Every time he questioned a fact, records emerged to support it. The pressure increased even further when some authorities began to pay attention to the case. Several departments requested access to certain historical documents. They also initiated revisions related to old real estate operations. What initially seemed like a reputation problem began to transform into a much more serious matter. Meanwhile, Eleanor observed everything with mixed feelings. She didn't enjoy seeing anyone suffer, nor did she feel satisfaction from the scandal, but she did experience a sense of justice. For years she had endured silent humiliations. For years they had treated her as someone unimportant. Now the truth was coming to light on its own. One afternoon, she received an unexpected call from Patricia. Her mother-in-law's voice sounded completely different from months ago. There was no longer arrogance nor superiority. There was concern, a lot of concern. Patricia asked her to talk. She asked her to find a solution before the situation worsened. She even hinted that they could reach an agreement beneficial to everyone. Eleanor listened in silence. When the conversation ended, she understood something she had never seen so clearly. For years she had sought approval within that family. She had tried to earn a place. She had tried to prove that she deserved respect. Now she no longer needed any of that. As the investigations continued, the residents of Harmony Creek began to show increasingly visible support. Many felt that Eleanor was defending not only her own lands but also a forgotten part of local history. Several people shared family testimonies related to property losses that occurred generations ago. Some new documents began to appear. Photographs, letters, and records stored for decades came out of old drawers and chests. The story continued to grow. Alex dedicated long days to reviewing all the material. Each new finding further strengthened the case. One night, while working in the main living room of the house, he found an especially important reference. It was a file archived many years ago that contained statements never considered by the authorities of the time. The statements coincided with several of the complaints found by Evelyn. Eleanor looked at the document and understood that they were getting closer to exposing the whole truth. Outside, darkness covered the lands of Harmony Creek, while the lights of the old house remained on. In different parts of the region, journalists, lawyers, officials, and citizens continued to talk about the case. The Sterling's reputation continued to deteriorate. Questions mounted, investigations advanced, and for the first time in decades, the secrets that had remained buried began to surface one after another without anyone being able to stop them. The scandal surrounding the Sterling family continued to grow, but for the first time in many months, Eleanor began to feel that her life stopped revolving around conflicts. The investigations continued, the lawyers were still working, and journalists were still publishing information related to the documents discovered by Mrs. Evelyn, but something had changed within her. She no longer woke up every morning thinking only about defending herself. Now she also thought about building. For years she had lived reacting to the decisions of others. First to her in-laws' criticisms, then to Richard's pressures, and later to threats related to the lands. Without realizing it, she had spent too much time fighting. Now she wanted to dedicate her energies to something different. She wanted to turn that place into something useful, something that would benefit the people who had welcomed her with open arms when she arrived in Harmony Creek, not knowing what to do with her future. The idea began to take shape one afternoon as she walked through the grounds with Alex. The sun was slowly setting behind the hills, and the breeze moved the branches of nearby trees. From that point, they could see much of the property. Eleanor contemplated the old house, the partially restored old barn, and the areas where specialists had confirmed the existence of the hot spring. For a few minutes, she remained silent. Alex noticed she was thinking about something. He asked her what was going on. Eleanor smiled. Then she pointed to the land stretching out before them. She said she had been imagining for days how that place might look in a few years. Alex listened attentively. Then Eleanor spoke for the first time of an idea she had kept to herself until then. She didn't want to sell. She didn't want to hand the property over to external businessmen. She didn't want a large company to come and build something that would only benefit outsiders. She wanted to develop the project herself. She wanted Harmony Creek to grow along with the property. She wanted the jobs, opportunities, and benefits to remain in the region. Alex smiled. He didn't seem surprised. In fact, he replied that he had been waiting for her to say exactly that. Over the following weeks, they began to work seriously on that vision. The first step was to meet with specialists in tourism, architecture, and regional development. Eleanor listened to dozens of opinions, reviewed proposals, analyzed budgets, and learned concepts she never imagined she would need to understand at 60. At first, everything seemed overwhelming. However, little by little she began to feel comfortable. She discovered that she had a natural ability to make practical decisions. She also understood something important. She didn't need to know everything. She just needed to surround herself with honest and capable people. As the plans progressed, the residents of Harmony Creek began to get involved. Many neighbors attended the community meetings Eleanor organized to explain the project. Ideas flowed constantly. Some proposed tourist services. Others talked about local crafts. Several farmers suggested ways to integrate regional products. What initially seemed like a simple private development began to transform into an initiative shared by much of the town. Rosie was one of the most enthusiastic. From the very beginning, she insisted that the project should preserve the identity of the place. She didn't want Harmony Creek to become an artificial destination unconnected to its history. Eleanor completely agreed, which is why she made an important decision. Mrs. Evelyn's old house would be restored. It would not be demolished. It would not be replaced by a modern building. It would become the heart of the project. The news was received with enthusiasm. Many neighbors knew the historical importance of that dwelling. Preserving it was a way of honoring the past while building the future. Work began a few months later. The transformation was impressive. Restoration teams arrived to repair damaged structures. Specialists recovered original architectural details. The rooms were renovated without losing the character they had had for decades. Every advance thrilled Eleanor. Sometimes she walked through the corridors, watching the old house come back to life. On more than one occasion, she thought of Evelyn. She thought about how much Evelyn would have liked to see all that. Meanwhile, the hot spring continued to be carefully studied and developed. Experts confirmed that the potential was even greater than initially estimated. The characteristics of the water were ideal for activities related to relaxation and well-being. That news attracted even more attention. Entrepreneurs from different regions continued sending offers to buy the property. Some figures were enormous, amounts that would have changed anyone's life, but Eleanor didn't even consider them. Her decision was made. She hadn't fought so hard to hand the project over to someone else. Far from Harmony Creek, Richard watched everything with growing frustration. Every new advance was a defeat for him. He had tried to appropriate the lands. He had pushed legal claims. He had sought agreements. Nothing had worked. Now he saw Eleanor building exactly what he had wanted to control. The situation became even more difficult when several official investigations related to old real estate operations continued to advance. Although the processes were slow, the Sterling family's reputation continued to deteriorate. Some business associations began to distance themselves. Old allies preferred to stay out of it. For the first time in many years, Richard experienced something he didn't know how to handle well: the loss of influence. Meanwhile, in Harmony Creek, the project was advancing at high speed. New jobs began to appear. Masons, electricians, carpenters, gardeners. Dozens of people found work thanks to the construction. Many young people who had thought about leaving the region began to reconsider their plans. The atmosphere in the town changed. There was optimism. There was movement. There were expectations. One morning, Eleanor was walking through the town square when she overheard a conversation between two neighbors. They were talking about the possibility of opening new businesses. One planned to open a coffee shop. Another wanted to expand a family store. Those words moved her more than she expected because they showed that change was already happening. It wasn't a future promise. It was a reality. The months continued to pass. The restoration of the house reached a decisive stage. The gardens were restored. The areas near the hot spring began to take shape. The internal paths were improved. Each week brought visible progress. Alex remained close throughout the process. Although he continued to collaborate on historical investigations related to Evelyn's documents, much of his time was dedicated to the project. The relationship between him and Eleanor had also strengthened enormously. They shared long conversations, exchanged ideas, and supported each other through difficult times. The trust built during the investigation had turned into a deep friendship. One afternoon, while observing the works from a newly finished terrace, Alex asked her if she had ever imagined living something like this. Eleanor let out a small laugh. She replied that years ago she barely imagined surviving the Sterling family gatherings. Both laughed. Then they remained observing the landscape. Before them stretched a project that months earlier seemed impossible. The place that had been a source of mockery was now transforming into one of the most promising spaces in the entire region. As the inauguration date approached, excitement began to fill every corner of Harmony Creek. The townspeople talked constantly about it. Visitors began to arrive out of curiosity. Even some media outlets returned to document the transformation. Eleanor's story continued to attract attention. A woman who had been despised by her own family was now leading one of the most important projects in the area. But for her, the real success was not in the headlines. It was in something much simpler. Every time she saw the neighbors working, every time she heard young people talk about staying in the town, every time she saw the old house full of life again, she understood that she was building something that went far beyond a hot spring or a successful business. And as the final preparations advanced under the clear sky of Harmony Creek, Eleanor felt that the most important chapter of her life was just beginning. Eleanor barely slept the night before the official inauguration of the Harmony Creek Hot Springs Resort. Many months had passed since she arrived in Harmony Creek with a truck loaded with boxes, memories, and doubts. Now, as she looked out the window of the restored old house, she saw well-kept gardens, illuminated paths, and buildings that were part of a project that seemed impossible when it all began. From early morning, the entire town was bustling with activity. The residents of Harmony Creek walked back and forth, finishing preparations, arranging decorations, and organizing the last details to welcome visitors. Eleanor walked through every corner of the place, with a mixture of pride and emotion. Every restored wall, every planted tree, and every renovated space represented a victory against all the people who once mocked her. However, although the inauguration was important, something else occupied her thoughts. Over the last few weeks, Alex had continued reviewing Mrs. Evelyn's documents. After all that had been discovered, both were convinced that there was still one piece missing to complete the story. Evelyn had dedicated too many years to that investigation, for everything to end only with the hot spring and the documents about the land. There was something more, something still hidden. That same morning, before the official events began, Alex arrived at the house holding a small wooden box. His expression was different. Eleanor noticed it immediately. He seemed nervous and excited at the same time. When she asked him what was happening, he replied that he had found something inside a wall during the final restoration work of a room that belonged to Evelyn. The box was small and carefully protected. It didn't seem like an object accidentally forgotten. It seemed to have been deliberately hidden. Eleanor felt her heart begin to race. Both sat at a table in Evelyn's old study. Very carefully, they opened the box. Inside, they found several folded documents and a sealed envelope. On the front of the envelope was a phrase written in Evelyn's unmistakable handwriting, "For Eleanor, when the time comes." For a few seconds, neither said a word. Eleanor felt a lump in her throat. They had spent months following clues left by that woman. Now she had before her a message written directly for her. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope. Inside, she found several carefully preserved sheets. She began to read in silence. The first line spoke of family memories. Evelyn explained that she had watched Eleanor from afar for many years. She said she always knew Eleanor was a strong woman, though few people seemed to realize it. Eleanor felt her eyes begin to moisten. She continued reading. Then the first revelation appeared. Evelyn was not simply a distant aunt. She was actually the sister of Eleanor's true grandmother. For decades, various family conflicts had caused separations and silences that ended up hiding that connection. Evelyn explained that she had spent much of her life investigating the family's history because she knew a truth that almost everyone had forgotten. Eleanor continued through the pages. Each line increased her surprise. Evelyn recounted how several lands belonging to their ancestors had been taken many years ago during fraudulent operations. The documents found during the investigation confirmed part of that story. But the letter went much further. According to Evelyn, the lands where the hot spring was now located were part of Eleanor's family's original heritage, long before the Sterling's fortune existed. Eleanor remained motionless. That revelation was enormous. Her entire life, she had thought that the Sterlings represented wealth, power, and a social position far superior to her family's. Now she discovered that part of that wealth had been built on properties that originally belonged to her own ancestors. Alex watched in silence as she continued reading. Then another unexpected detail appeared. Evelyn explained that James, Eleanor's husband, had discovered part of the truth years before he died. Eleanor looked up immediately. Her heart pounded. She reread it several times to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. The letter was clear. James had found documents related to Evelyn's investigation a long time ago. Although he never knew the whole story, he did understand that there were irregularities in the origin of certain family properties. As Evelyn explained, James decided to remain silent because he feared the consequences within his own family. However, he had also taken steps to protect Eleanor without her knowing. Among these measures was the decision to discreetly help Evelyn preserve certain important documents. Eleanor felt tears begin to stream down her cheeks. For years she had loved James and trusted him, knowing that he had tried to protect her even when he faced his own family. Conflicts deeply moved her, but the letter was not yet finished. The last pages contained something even more impactful. Evelyn explained that the inheritance had never been a coincidence. She didn't choose Eleanor simply because she was a distant relative. She chose her because she was the last person capable of reclaiming what the family had lost generations ago. For decades, Evelyn gathered evidence, protected documents, and prepared everything so that someday the truth could come to light. She had hoped to find someone with the strength needed to continue that task, and she was convinced that person was Eleanor. Silence filled the room when she finished reading. Outside, the activity related to the inauguration continued. But inside that study, it seemed that time had stopped. Alex remained silent for several minutes. Finally, he spoke. He said that many pieces had just fallen into place. The investigations, the letters, the maps, and Evelyn's obsession with protecting those documents all made sense. Eleanor looked at the pages again. For months she believed she was discovering secrets about other people. Now she understood that she was also discovering her own history. Hours later, the official inauguration began. Dozens of visitors arrived at the Hot Springs Resort. Town residents, businessmen, journalists, and authorities toured the facilities. The excitement was evident everywhere. Eleanor participated in the events, greeted attendees, and thanked them for the support received during those months. However, something had changed within her. She no longer saw that place merely as a successful property. Now she saw it as the return of something that had been lost for generations. Meanwhile, in the distance, Edward, Patricia, and Richard watched the news about the inauguration. None were invited. None dared to appear. For years they had despised that house, mocked the lands. They had tried to expel Eleanor when they thought she had nothing of value. Now they watched as the place they considered a ruin became a symbol of success for the entire region. But the biggest difference was something else. They could no longer control the story. They could no longer hide the truth. They could no longer decide who deserved respect and who did not. As evening fell, when the celebrations began to wane, Eleanor walked away for a few minutes to stroll alone through the gardens. The sky was tinged with the colors of sunset. The hotel lights began to turn on one by one. In the distance, she heard the conversations and laughter of the people enjoying the place. She stopped near an area from where she could observe Evelyn's old house. She remained there for several minutes. She thought of James. She thought of Evelyn. She thought of everything that had happened since that dinner where they mocked the inheritance. Then she smiled. Not because she had defeated the Sterlings, not because she had gained money or recognition. She smiled because she finally understood something that had remained hidden for generations. The house that everyone called useless. It was never a burden, never a misfortune, never a mistake. It was a legacy carefully protected for decades, waiting to return to the hands of the family to whom it truly belonged. And as the hot springs continued to flow beneath the land of Harmony Creek, Eleanor gazed at the horizon, knowing that the story that had begun with a humiliation ended up revealing a truth much greater than anyone had imagined.